The cold metal closed around my wrists before I even finished reaching into my jacket for the paper that would have ended the whole thing in about 10 seconds. Lenora Whitcomb stood behind the 2 stone pillars my own father had once used to hang an iron gate, smiling like she had just chased a trespasser off her personal estate. I did not fight the cuffs. I only looked past her shoulder at the bronze sign, reading Briarstone Reserve, bolted to posts that were sitting on land no developer had ever legally owned. When Police Chief Gideon Shaw arrived and pulled up the county land records on the laptop in his cruiser, he went quiet for a long moment, then turned to Lenora and asked her why my name was sitting on top of the entire road she claimed belonged to her community. If you want to watch a woman lose her title, her leverage, and her carefully built kingdom over a piece of paper she refused to read, stay with me, because this story only gets heavier from here. My name is Elias Rourke, and 6 months after I buried my father, I moved back into the old wooden house on Rourke Ranch to fix the roof, mend the fences, and finally stop putting off the life I had been avoiding for 20 years. The ranch sat behind a gated community called Briarstone Reserve, but the road running through it had existed nearly 80 years before anyone poured a foundation for those manicured houses. I noticed almost immediately that my father's old iron gate was gone, replaced by 2 towering stone pillars, a guard booth, cameras, and that same bronze sign announcing a neighborhood I had never joined. Every time I wanted to drive onto my own property, a security guard in a pressed uniform asked me to show identification like I was visiting someone else's home. I never raised my voice. I simply handed over my deed and explained calmly that the road had belonged to my family since 1948. The guard admitted, almost apologetically, that Lenora had personally instructed the staff not to let me open the gate on my own. A week later, a violation notice arrived from the Homeowners Association, claiming my father's old work truck was, in their words, damaging the visual standards of the community. The letter demanded I register as a visitor every single time I entered land that had never belonged to their organization in the first place. When I called the HOA office, Lenora answered personally, her tone dripping with the kind of condescension reserved for people she assumed had nothing to lose. She told me my old claim to the road meant nothing now that Briarstone had been built around it, and that I should learn my place before I embarrassed myself further. I did not argue. I simply told her she might want to check the county records before she sent another letter like that one. I remembered, standing there reading that trespassing notice, how my father used to talk about the neighborhood being built around us like a slow tide, creeping in from every direction. He never sold a single acre to the developers, no matter how many offers arrived in thick envelopes with impressive letterhead. He used to say that a signature on a check disappears in a season, but a signature on a deed outlives the person who signs it. I had spent years working as an engineer specializing in infrastructure and land rights for a construction firm 2 states away, reading easements and boundary surveys the way other men read box scores. It was strange, almost darkly funny, to come home and find myself standing on the wrong side of exactly the kind of paperwork I used to untangle for a living. I told myself, quietly, that whatever Lenora thought she understood about property law, I likely understood it better, and I intended to prove that with documents rather than shouting. That night, digging through my father's old tool shed, I found a rusted iron key and a scrap of paper in his handwriting that read, "The gate may change, but the ground beneath it is still ours." I laughed a little when I read it, thinking he had written it as a joke for himself during some long-forgotten dispute. I did not know yet how prophetic those 11 words would turn out to be. The next morning I discovered the HOA had changed the locks on the very gate I had been using my whole life, and posted a new sign that read, "Elias Rourke is prohibited from trespassing on private Briarstone Reserve property." I stood there in the cold morning air, staring at my own name printed on a trespassing notice for land that had my family's history buried 3 feet under the soil. It was the moment I stopped believing this was a misunderstanding and started treating it like a fight. I drove straight to the Cedar Falls County Records Office, where a clerk named Harlan Keene pulled every document tied to Parcel 18B without a hint of hesitation. Harlan confirmed what I already suspected, that I was the current and sole legal owner of that narrow but lengthy strip of land, and that strip happened to include the entire entry road, the exact position of the gate, and the guard booth itself. Buried in an older file, he found something even more damning: a temporary right-of-way that had once been granted to Bancroft communities during the original construction of the neighborhood. That right-of-way had explicitly expired after 36 months and had never once been renewed or purchased outright. I asked for certified copies of everything, but I did not act right away, because part of me still wanted to give Lenora the chance to fix this quietly before it became something uglier. I sent the Homeowners Association a polite letter, attaching my deed and requesting a simple meeting to sort out what I assumed was an honest clerical error. Lenora never bothered reading past the first paragraph. Her reply insisted that the association's own community map was the only document that mattered, and that I owed them $500 a day for what she called unauthorized use of a private entrance. I reminded her, in writing, that an association has no legal authority to fine a person who was never a member of that association to begin with. She laughed on the phone when I said it, telling me that men like me always assumed an old piece of paper could stand against a community worth hundreds of millions of dollars. To prove her point, she had her security team install an additional barrier arm directly in front of the turn leading onto my own driveway. Some of the residents noticed the tension building at the gate, and a few quietly admitted to me they felt something about the situation was unfair, though none of them wanted to challenge Lenora out loud. I removed the barrier arm myself one afternoon, carefully, without damaging a single bolt, and simply set it aside on the grass beside the guard booth. The community cameras captured the entire thing, every calm, deliberate second of it, and Lenora would use that footage exactly the way I expected her to. Sergeant Merritt Kane and another officer arrived at my gate less than an hour later, called in by a furious voice, claiming a hostile man was destroying private community property. Lenora was already waiting there when they pulled up, holding a colored map and a folder thick with violation notices, introducing herself as president of Briarstone Reserve, as though the title alone settled the matter. She called me a repeat trespasser, emphasized the value of the neighborhood behind her, and pushed her narrative before I could get a single sentence in edgewise. I tried to hand Merritt my certified deed, but Lenora kept talking over me, insisting I did not even live inside the community, and therefore had no right to be standing at that gate at all. Merritt looked at the barrier arm lying in the grass, listened to a one-sided account of events, and asked me to turn around and place my hands behind my back. I did not resist. I only asked him, as calmly as I could manage, to read the paper folded inside my jacket pocket before he did anything further. Lenora told him the paper was nothing but a stalling tactic from a man who knew he was in the wrong. As the cuffs clicked shut around my wrists, she leaned in close enough that only I could hear her, and told me this was what happened to men who did not understand who really held the power. I told her that her power would only last until someone finally read the right parcel number. A resident recording from a distance caught the whole exchange on a phone, and Lenora immediately ordered security to send that person away from the gate. Because the incident happened at the main entrance, and Lenora had called the town office directly, Chief Gideon Shaw drove out personally to check on what was becoming a fairly public scene. Gideon did not care about reputations or property values, or how many zeros were attached to the average home price inside Briarstone. He asked, simply and firmly, to see official documentation, and Lenora handed him a homeowners association map that carried no stamp from the county recorder's office anywhere on it. Gideon pulled the certified deed from my jacket himself since my hands were still cuffed, then walked back to his cruiser and ran the parcel information through the county land system. He compared the parcel code, the coordinates, and the boundary lines against everything on his screen with the patience of a man who had learned long ago not to trust a confident voice over a verified record. My name, Elias Rourke, appeared clearly across the entire yellow highlighted strip of land running from the public road all the way to Rourke Ranch. Gideon asked Lenora what legal basis she had for declaring this HOA property, and she answered that her map had been in use for 10 straight years without a single complaint. He told her, evenly, that 10 years of assumed use does not transform a person into a legal owner, especially when the original access agreement had a clearly printed expiration date attached to it. Gideon ordered the cuffs removed because there was no longer any reasonable basis to detain me for trespassing on land the county's own records confirmed was mine. Once my wrists were free, I looked directly at Lenora and told her she had not simply built a gate on my property, she had apparently sold a lie to more than 100 families who trusted her judgment. Gideon explained that officers on the scene could not fully resolve a property dispute right there in the driveway, but the current records made it clear the association had no authority to have me arrested for standing on land I legally owned. Merritt apologized quietly for not checking the paperwork before reaching for his handcuffs, and I did not try to humiliate him for it. Instead, I asked that his body camera footage and every document Lenora had provided be preserved exactly as they were, since something about that map already felt wrong to me. Gideon agreed without hesitation, because the map Lenora had handed him carried no recording number, no surveyor's signature, and no county seal anywhere on its surface. I noticed a strange gap along one edge of the paper, as if a line of text had been deliberately trimmed away before it was printed for the police. Lenora kept insisting the association held a permanent agreement for use of the road, so I handed Gideon the original document proving that agreement had only ever granted 36 months of temporary access. Gideon asked her directly whether she had ever seen that particular paper before, and she denied it so quickly that even he seemed to catch the hesitation underneath her words. A board member named Spencer Hale, standing near the edge of the crowd, accidentally mentioned a survey letter from the previous year, and Lenora cut him off before he could finish the sentence. It was in that small, clumsy interruption that I first understood the association had been warned about this exact boundary problem long before I ever moved back onto the ranch. Gideon instructed Lenora that she could not obstruct my access to the property until a court said otherwise, and she was forced, in front of her own residence, to order the barrier arm raised. I drove through my own gate that afternoon, but there was no real victory in it, because more than 100 families were still using a road with no legitimate legal right of access. Closing that road immediately would have stranded ambulances, fire trucks, and ordinary families who had done nothing wrong, so I chose not to punish innocent people for the sins of their association's leadership. I sent written notice allowing temporary continued use of the road while a proper survey and negotiation took place, on the sole condition that the HOA stop publicly claiming ownership and hand over every transfer document connected to Bancroft communities. That night, Lenora sent an email to the entire neighborhood claiming I was attempting to seize their road and hold the community hostage for financial gain. Her email turned a good number of residents against me overnight, and I watched cars slow down along the fence line, phones raised, drivers scowling, as though I had personally stolen something from their families. I did not respond with accusations of my own. Instead, I hired a licensed land surveyor named Audra Bell to conduct an independent review using old iron boundary markers, satellite mapping data, subdivision plats, and generations of chain of title records. While she worked, HOA security tried repeatedly to stop her from placing her marking stakes near the entrance, until Audra calmly reminded them that obstructing a licensed surveyor carried its own legal consequences. Bright orange stakes began appearing all around the gate over the following days, and what they revealed left almost everyone stunned into silence. Both stone pillars stood entirely on my land. The guard booth encroached more than 18 feet across the boundary. The security cameras were mounted on posts owned outright by me. Roughly 410 feet of decorative wall sat on the wrong side of the line, and a drainage ditch belonging to the association was discharging directly onto my property without any permit whatsoever. Beneath a flower bed near the old pillar, Audra even uncovered the buried foundation of my father's original iron gate, crushed and forgotten under decorative stone. I finally understood that the developer had not simply borrowed a road for convenience. Years earlier, they had physically destroyed a piece of my family's history to build a symbol for their own gated community. Lenora called an emergency meeting and barred me from attending because I was not a dues-paying member of the association I supposedly held hostage. I stood outside the hall, handing residents copies of the survey and the county records as they walked in, and some began quietly asking why they had been paying association fees for years to maintain something the association apparently never owned. Records later showed the HOA had collected more than $900,000 over time, specifically earmarked for maintaining that shared property that legally belonged to my family the entire time. Lenora insisted every dollar had been spent appropriately and accused me of fabricating the survey to manipulate the neighborhood. Audra responded by publicly listing her license number and inviting any qualified professional in the state to independently verify her findings. Vivian Locke, the association's attorney, asked Lenora for the first time to produce every original transfer document from the very beginning of the community's construction. Lenora claimed several boxes of records had been lost years earlier during an office relocation, an excuse that satisfied absolutely no one in that room. Spencer quietly reached out to me afterward and revealed that the board had received a warning letter the previous year from a title insurance company, cautioning that the road had never been properly transferred to the association. Lenora had instructed the entire board to keep that warning confidential to avoid, in her exact words, causing panic among the residents. I began to understand, piece by piece, exactly how deep Lenora's silence had run over the years. She had chaired the association for nearly 9 years, long enough to build relationships with vendors, contractors, and board members who trusted her word over any independent verification. Several longtime residents told me, once they felt safe enough to speak honestly, that anyone who questioned her decisions in an open meeting was usually met with a quiet fine or a pointed letter within a week. One family described being threatened with a lien on their home simply for asking why the association's landscaping contract had tripled in cost over 3 years. Another resident, an older man named Walter Pruitt, who had lived in Briarstone since it first opened, told me he once tried to request the original transfer documents from the county and was informed by Lenora's office that such records were, in her words, not available to individual homeowners. It became clear that the entire structure of the community had been built on the assumption that no one would ever bother checking behind the curtain, and for almost a decade, that assumption had held. The truth was becoming impossible to deny, that Lenora had never been confused about ownership at all, and yet she had still made the choice to call the police and have me arrested at my own gate. Spencer handed me a copy of a signed meeting record that instructed board members not to contact the Rourke family until Bancroft resolved the ownership issue on their own terms. A short while later, I received an invitation to meet privately with Conrad Bancroft, the chief executive of the very company that had built Briarstone Reserve around my family's land. His office arranged the meeting through a lawyer rather than through Lenora, which told me on its own that the company had already begun treating her as a liability rather than a partner. Conrad greeted me warmly inside a private hotel suite, never once acknowledging or apologizing for the fact that I had been handcuffed in front of my own home. He described the entire situation as nothing more than an old administrative oversight from a project completed nearly a decade earlier. He offered me $300,000 for Parcel 18B, on the condition that I keep the dispute quiet, drop any complaint against the police, publicly state the association had acted in good faith, and never speak to residents or press about what had actually happened. I began to understand that this was never really about the width of a road, but about the possibility that hundreds of real estate transactions could unravel if Briarstone never had legitimate access to begin with. Conrad reminded me that large companies could afford lawyers capable of stretching a lawsuit out for years, hoping the threat alone would push me toward accepting his offer. I told him plainly that the land records had existed longer than his entire company, and I was not interested in outlasting his patience. He raised the offer to $600,000, and I still refused, laying out my own conditions instead. I wanted a public acknowledgement of the mistake, coverage of every survey and legal cost I had already paid, relocation of the gate and guard booth to sit on actual HOA property, a legitimate right-of-way granted properly to residents, and fair compensation for the destruction of my family's original gate. Conrad accused me of chasing the role of a hero, and I told him I simply refused to trade my silence so Lenora could keep calling innocent people trespassers. After that meeting, Vivian Locke reached out to me privately and disclosed that Lenora had a consulting agreement with a subsidiary of Bancroft's company, one that had paid her $85,000 over 3 years for what the contract vaguely called community relations support. That payment had never been disclosed to the rest of the board, and in exchange, Lenora had quietly delayed pressing Bancroft to correct the ownership issue for years. Vivian was not yet ready to hand over that document, citing her professional obligations, but she warned me Lenora was preparing to petition the court for a restraining order to keep me away from my own gate entirely. It was becoming clear that Lenora wanted to turn a landowner into a man legally forbidden from walking onto the very property that carried his name. I spent that evening sitting on my father's porch, turning the whole situation over in my mind, trying to separate the parts of me that wanted justice from the parts of me that simply wanted the fighting to stop. $1 million was not a small number to a man who had spent the last year fixing fences and patching a roof on a fixed budget. I thought about how easy it would be to take the money, sign whatever agreement Conrad's lawyers put in front of me, and let Briarstone continue exactly as it always had. But I kept coming back to the image of Lenora leaning close to my ear at that gate, certain that a title and a confident voice were enough to make a lie sound like the truth. I thought about the families inside that neighborhood who had bought their homes believing every promise printed in the glossy brochure, never knowing the road beneath their tires legally belonged to someone else. Selling my silence would not have made any of that untrue. It would only have made me complicit in keeping it hidden a little longer. The escalation continued when Conrad sent over a revised agreement worth a full $1 million, hoping the number alone would finally settle things quietly. I wrote 3 words across the top of that offer, "Not for sale," and mailed it straight back to him without a phone call or an explanation. The very next morning I received a court summons, since the association was seeking an emergency order, claiming I posed an imminent threat to what they called the lifeline entrance of their entire community. The hearing took place at the county courthouse, where Lenora arrived, flanked by Vivian and several board members, prepared to paint me as a selfish landowner threatening to lock a gate, crash property values, and endanger frightened families. I did not walk in with a large legal team behind me, only a straightforward land attorney named Nolan Pierce and Audra, carrying her certified survey documents. Nolan calmly established that I had never closed the road at all and had voluntarily allowed continued resident access while the ownership dispute was worked out through proper channels. It was the association, not me, that had repeatedly tried to block my access to my own family's ranch. Vivian presented the community map once again, but under direct questioning she could not produce a single transfer deed proving Briarstone had ever legally acquired parcel 18B. Judge Miriam Caldwell looked directly at Lenora and asked whether the association was truly requesting the court forbid a man from stepping onto land that was legally recorded in his own name. Lenora argued that the interests of an entire community outweighed the property rights of a single individual, and the judge answered that community interest does not grant any organization the authority to manufacture its own deed. Audra presented her certified survey along with photographs of every disputed boundary marker, while Nolan entered the expired temporary right-of-way into the record for everyone to see. Spencer submitted the meeting minutes proving Lenora had known about the boundary problem long before that afternoon at the gate, and Lenora insisted the record had simply been misunderstood by everyone present. Then Merritt's body camera footage was played aloud in the courtroom, capturing Lenora repeatedly insisting the association owned the land and demanding my arrest even as I tried, again and again, to hand over my certified deed. The judge denied the association's request for a restraining order and instead issued a temporary ruling that forbade the HOA from blocking my access, required me to continue allowing resident traffic while the matter proceeded, prohibited either side from altering any disputed structures, and ordered the association to preserve every relevant record in its possession. It was during this hearing that Vivian quietly realized Lenora had handed her a different version of the community map than the one given to the police on the day of my arrest. The version Vivian had originally reviewed carried a small handwritten note reading temporary right of use, a note that was conspicuously missing from the copy Lenora gave to the responding officers. Nolan pointed out to the judge that this was not simply a case of two neighbors disagreeing over a fence line. It was a case where an organization representing more than 300 households had allowed its own leadership to manufacture the appearance of ownership over land that never belonged to it, and had used that manufactured appearance to justify calling the police on a private citizen standing on his own property. The judge asked Lenora, plainly, whether she had personally reviewed the boundary documents before authorizing the fines and the barrier installations at the entrance. Lenora hesitated for the first time since the hearing began, then answered that she had relied on information provided by prior board leadership and by representatives of Bancroft communities. That answer, vague as it was, marked the first time in the entire dispute that she had admitted, even indirectly, that her certainty had never been built on anything solid. That discovery turned the dispute from a civil disagreement into something with far heavier consequences, since deliberately altering a document used to justify a person's arrest could easily cross into criminal territory. Outside the courthouse steps, Gideon approached Lenora directly and told her the department needed a full explanation for why the paperwork she had given his officers did not match the original document on file. Gideon did not arrest her on the spot, choosing instead to forward everything to the county prosecutor's office for a proper review of the evidence. Investigators gathered the altered map from the arrest scene, Merritt's body camera recordings, internal association emails, the board's meeting minutes, and the consulting contract tied to Bancroft's subsidiary company. Lenora returned to Briarstone and attempted to rally support against me, proposing that association reserves be used to fund an aggressive legal counteroffensive. Residents pushed back hard once they learned the reserve fund was already short nearly $240,000 from its expected balance. A closer look at the financial reports revealed repeated payments to a road maintenance company whose listed contact address matched an office belonging to Lenora's own brother. I never publicly accused her of embezzlement, since I did not yet have proof solid enough to make that claim responsibly, so I limited myself to releasing only the documents that had already been fully verified. My steady, measured approach began winning over residents who had once believed Lenora's version of events without question. An elderly homeowner admitted that Lenora had once threatened her with fines simply for asking a question about who actually owned the front gate. Others came forward describing how Lenora had used security guards, escalating fines, and threatening legal letters to silence anyone who dared question her authority. The board eventually held a vote to suspend Lenora's operating authority on a temporary basis while the investigation continued. She declared the vote invalid and refused to surrender the office keys or the association's official records. Vivian formally announced she would no longer represent Lenora personally, citing an unavoidable conflict of interest given what the documents had revealed. Conrad Bancroft moved quickly to distance his company from her as well, publicly insisting Lenora had only ever operated as an independent contractor with no official connection to his firm. Lenora finally realized that everyone who had once benefited quietly from her silence was now abandoning her at exactly the moment she needed them most. In a moment of desperation, she drove out to the gate late one night and demanded security remove Audra's marking stakes from along the boundary line. The guard on duty refused, reminding her that the court had specifically ordered the property preserved exactly as it stood. Lenora pulled one stake out of the ground herself, and the entire moment was captured cleanly on the gate's own security camera. It was not a violent act, but it proved she was still willing to interfere with evidence, even after a judge had ordered everything left untouched. Word of that late-night incident spread through the neighborhood faster than any official newsletter ever could. Residents who had once defended Lenora out of loyalty or habit began quietly distancing themselves, unwilling to attach their own names to whatever came next. A woman who had served on the social committee for years told me she had finally watched the full-body camera footage from the day of my arrest, and it made her physically sick to realize how confidently Lenora had lied to the officers standing right in front of her. Even Merritt, still carrying the weight of his own mistake that afternoon, began cooperating fully with investigators, providing timestamps and internal radio logs that helped establish exactly how quickly Lenora had pushed for an arrest before anyone had a chance to verify a single fact. The next morning I walked out to the spot where that stake had been torn from the earth and found a rusted metal box buried just beneath the surface, one my father must have hidden there years earlier to protect exactly this kind of truth. Inside were old photographs of the original Rourke Gate before it was destroyed, early construction drawings from the Briarstone project, a letter my father had written objecting to the developer's plan for a permanent stone entrance, and a written commitment, signed by a Bancroft representative, promising that every temporary structure would be removed once construction was finished. The drawings made it painfully clear that the company had known the exact property boundary from the very beginning of the project, long before a single house was ever built. Conrad could no longer describe any of this as a simple administrative oversight once those documents became part of the public record. Nolan formally added Bancroft Communities to the lawsuit, exposing the company to claims of unauthorized construction on private land false advertising about shared community amenities, failure to disclose a serious access problem to buyers, and destruction of property belonging to the Rourke family. Title insurance companies connected to dozens of home sales inside Briarstone began demanding that Bancroft resolve the matter immediately, since unresolved ownership disputes threatened to unravel a wide range of existing transactions. Conrad returned to the negotiating table, and this time there was no trace of threat left in his voice. I agreed not to pursue further harm against ordinary residents as long as the company accepted a complete and fair resolution. My conditions were simple and unwavering: that Bancroft cover every legal and survey expense already incurred, provide fair compensation to my family, relocate the gate and guard booth fully inside the association's own boundary, restore the damaged drainage system, grant residents a permanent and properly recorded right-of-way, publicly disclose every payment ever made to Lenora, and have the association formally acknowledge that Rourke Ranch fell entirely outside their jurisdiction. Conrad accepted every single term, understanding that a full public trial would likely cost his company far more than any private settlement ever could. His attorneys spent nearly 2 weeks negotiating the finer language of the agreement, but on every point that actually mattered, they conceded rather than risk a jury hearing the story of a buried gate and a family that had been quietly erased from its own front entrance. Somewhere along the way, the company also quietly settled with several homeowners who had begun asking their own title companies uncomfortable questions, a sign that the damage from this single dispute had already started rippling outward far beyond my fence line. In the final hearing, Judge Caldwell confirmed once and for all that I held clear legal ownership of Parcel 18B, and that the association had never possessed any legitimate claim to the gate, the guard booth, or the road itself. A new, properly recorded right-of-way agreement was established specifically to protect the residents who had done nothing wrong throughout the entire ordeal. Shortly after the ruling, Gideon appeared with a warrant connected to Lenora's submission of an altered document and her false statements to responding officers. There was no dramatic struggle at the gate this time. Gideon simply asked Lenora to step aside, read her rights aloud, and place the cuffs on her with the same calm procedure any officer would follow for anyone else. I stood a short distance away, and I did not smile or gloat as it happened. Lenora looked back at the very gate where she had once ordered me handcuffed for standing on my own land. She asked me, almost bitterly, whether I felt satisfied watching her lose everything she had built. I told her I had never wanted to take anything that belonged to her, and that she was the only one who had spent months trying to hold on to something that was never truly hers in the first place. As workers began removing the heavy bronze Briarstone sign from the 2 stone pillars, a second inscription was revealed underneath, one that had been covered for years, reading Rourke Ranch, established 1948. A few weeks later, Briarstone residents elected an entirely new board, with Spencer agreeing to serve only in a temporary role so no one could accuse him of exploiting the crisis for his own benefit. The new board released full financial records and hired an independent auditor to trace every questionable payment that had ever left the association's accounts. Vivian cooperated fully within the bounds the law allowed her, handing over what records she legally could to support the ongoing investigation. Bancroft ultimately paid a substantial settlement, though the specific figure remained confidential under the terms of the agreement. I used part of that settlement to restore the ranch's fencing, repair the damaged drainage system, and rebuild an iron gate modeled directly after my father's original design and drawings. The new Briarstone entrance was constructed well inside the association's actual boundary, and the guard booth no longer sat anywhere near the turn leading onto my property. The right-of-way was formally recorded to reflect the truth that I remained the sole owner of the land, Residents retained a legitimate right to use the road, the association bore a fair share of maintenance costs, and Briarstone had no authority whatsoever over who was permitted to visit Rourke Ranch. The new board suggested renaming the road entirely, hoping to quietly bury the memory of the scandal that had unfolded there. I declined the suggestion, telling them that history should not be erased, simply because it made people uncomfortable to remember it. Merritt visited the ranch not long after, bringing with him the old iron key that had been taken from me on the day of my arrest. He apologized again, admitting he had allowed a title and a confident voice to override his own judgment that afternoon. I accepted the key and told him that an honest mistake, once acknowledged, could still be forgiven and corrected. Gideon stopped by when the new gate was finally finished, glancing at the small sign reading Rourke Ranch and remarking that it finally matched what the county's own records had said all along. I never sought to become the new president of the association, never tried to control Briarstone from behind the scenes, and never turned my frustration against the residents who lived there. All I had ever wanted was the simple right to walk through my own gate without needing anyone's permission to prove I belonged. Some of those residents came to the small gathering when the new gate opened, arriving not as members of an association, but simply as neighbors. They finally understood that the man Lenora had once branded a threat to their community was, in truth, the very person who had protected their right to drive home every single day. On the first morning after the new gate was completed, I drove my father's old work truck from the ranch out toward the main road and slowed between the two freshly cleaned stone pillars. The bronze Briarstone Reserve sign was gone from that spot entirely. In its place stood a simple iron plaque bearing the name Rourke Ranch, with no decorative lighting, no camera pointed at my window, and no threatening language aimed at anyone passing through. Deeper inside the neighborhood, Briarstone's own new entrance functioned exactly as it should, sitting properly on land the association actually owned. Residents still had a clear way home every morning, and the property values Lenora had once warned would collapse never fell at all. The only real difference was that everything now stood in plain, verified truth instead of a story someone had convinced hundreds of people to believe. I glanced down at the faint mark still visible on my wrist, the place where the cuffs had once closed so tightly around me. I never treated that mark like an old wound to nurse. I treated it instead as a quiet reminder that a lie can look remarkably convincing when it is spoken with enough confidence by someone standing behind a large gate in expensive clothing. But no lie survives forever once real records, honest boundaries, and people willing to actually read them enter the picture. Gideon drove past that same morning, rolled down his window, and asked, half joking, whether the new gate needed any paperwork checked before he let it pass. I smiled and held up the old iron key without saying a word. He smiled back and drove on toward the rest of his day. I closed the gate myself, listening to the low metal sound echo across the quiet morning air, a sound that carried nothing of revenge in it at all. It was simply the sound of something that had been taken away far too long, finally being set back exactly where it belonged. My name still sits on the county land records, right where it has always been. And now, once again, it sits on the gate as well.